Every weekday followed the same rhythm for me: coffee in the morning, reports to complete, meetings to attend, and endless calls to handle. Sarah, my wife, would always greet me at home in the evening with a warm smile, asking about my day. She didn't work, but kept herself busy with courses, volunteering, and outings with her friends. Our life seemed stable and predictable, something I valued deeply. Yet, in recent weeks, I'd begun noticing small, almost insignificant details that started to gnaw at the back of my mind. On a Tuesday like any other, I was preparing for an important meeting, my focus buried in spreadsheets at the kitchen table. Sarah walked in, her energy apparent as she casually mentioned her plans for the day. She said she was meeting her friend Mary and Mary's son at a cafe before heading to her sister's house to help organize a kids' party. It was a perfectly normal thing for Sarah. She'd always been close to her family and friends. I barely glanced up, giving a short nod as I worked through some figures. However, when she leaned in to grab her bag, I caught a faint whiff of perfume I hadn't smelled before. It wasn't her usual light and floral scent. This one was rich, something more fitting for a fancy evening out than a daytime meet-up. I didn't think much of it at the time. Sarah often tried new things, and maybe this was just a gift or an impulse buy. But later, when I replayed the morning in my mind, the choice of such a strong fragrance for what seemed like a casual day struck me as odd. Still, I shrugged it off. There was no reason to overthink something so trivial. When she came home that evening, she was cheerful as always. I casually mentioned the perfume, and she laughed, saying her sister had given it to her to test out before gifting it to their mom. She even showed me a chat with her sister confirming the story. Her explanation made sense, and I chuckled at myself for even noticing. A few days later, on Friday, work had me stuck in the office late. I finally wrapped up and got home, exhausted, to find Sarah already settled in. She told me she'd spent the day volunteering at a local shelter, distributing food to the homeless. That sounded just like her. Sarah had always been compassionate and involved in community work. But as I walked into the kitchen, I saw her phone lying on the counter with the screen off. That was unusual. Sarah was never one to leave her phone far from her or on silent, especially not when she was out of the house. When I asked why it was off, she brushed it off, saying it had died while she was busy at the shelter and she'd forgotten to charge it. Her tone was casual, and she pointed to her volunteer badge sitting on the counter as if to validate her story. Everything seemed to check out, yet a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't quite add up. It wasn't the phone itself, but the growing accumulation of small oddities that lingered in my mind. The next day, Saturday, I decided to spend my time at home, working on one of my hobbies, assembling miniature models. Sarah said she was meeting Mary again, this time to discuss something important. I wished her a good time and focused on my work. Hours passed, and I got up to grab a drink from the kitchen. That's when I noticed a pair of sunglasses sitting on the hall table. They weren't mine, and I knew they didn't belong to Sarah either. The design was distinctive, and I was certain I'd never seen them before. I decided to wait until Sarah returned to ask about them. When she came home, she was her usual cheerful self. I pointed out the sunglasses, and she laughed, saying they belonged to Mary. Apparently, Mary had stopped by earlier to pick her up and left them behind. Sarah said she'd return them the next day and even sent Mary a text right in front of me to confirm the story. Mary's quick reply seemed to back her up. Still, the incident stayed with me longer than it should have. It wasn't the sunglasses alone, it was how these minor inconsistencies kept cropping up. By this point, the doubts had taken root, though I hadn't yet voiced them. Sarah was as lively and engaging as ever, but my instincts were nudging me to pay closer attention. It wasn't about mistrust, not yet, anyway. I trusted Sarah implicitly, but I also knew better than to ignore patterns, no matter how subtle. Over the following days, I began observing more closely, not just her actions, but also the context around them. I remembered how Sarah had always been meticulous about her routines, yet now there were deviations. She'd spend a little longer getting ready before going out, her outfit slightly more polished than what I was used to seeing for casual meetups. I'd find myself noting these changes, but keeping my observations to myself, unwilling to jump to conclusions without more clarity. Work kept me busy, but I found time to reflect. I'd never been one to dwell on uncertainties. When a problem presented itself, my approach had always been straightforward: gather the facts, assess the situation, and act accordingly. This felt no different. If there was something to be concerned about, I'd figure it out. Until then, I wouldn't let baseless doubts cloud my judgment. Over the next week, I started paying attention to small details around the house. Sarah's phone, for instance, had never been something I gave much thought to, but now I noticed how often she left it on silent or in another room. I'd occasionally catch her glancing at it during dinner, a habit that hadn't been there before. It wasn't frequent enough to be glaring, but it was different. Different was enough to catch my eye. On Thursday, she mentioned another outing with Mary planned for the weekend. This time, it was supposedly a trip to a new art exhibit downtown. Sarah loved art, and I had no reason to doubt her plans. But the mention of Mary again brought the sunglasses incident to mind. I decided not to say anything, simply noting it for later. Saturday came, and Sarah left for the exhibit. I decided to stay home again, finishing some projects I'd put off. Around noon, I checked my phone and saw a notification from a mutual acquaintance, someone who'd tagged Sarah in a post from earlier that morning. It wasn't anything major, just a casual mention of running into her at a coffee shop. Oddly enough, it wasn't near the exhibit she'd mentioned. That was the first moment I felt my certainty waver. While there could be a simple explanation, the inconsistency stood out. I made a mental note to ask her about it later, though I was careful not to jump to conclusions. As the day went on, I kept myself occupied, but the lingering questions remained. When Sarah came home, she was in a great mood, talking animatedly about the exhibit. I asked a few casual questions, listening carefully to her answers. Everything seemed to line up with her story, but my instincts told me to stay alert. It wasn't about catching her in a lie, it was about understanding whether there was anything to be concerned about in the first place. Reflecting on the past few weeks, I realized these small moments weren't isolated. They formed a pattern, one that I couldn't ignore. I wasn't one to act impulsively, but I believed in addressing situations head-on. If there was something going on, I needed to know. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now. It was clear to me that something didn't add up. The perfume, the phone, the sunglasses, the tag post, individually, they were insignificant. Together, they painted a picture that warranted my attention. I wasn't angry or hurt, but I was determined. Too many oddities had piled up, and it was time to stop brushing them aside. I'd always prided myself on being level-headed, and this situation would be no different. I decided I'd take a closer look, not out of suspicion, but to confirm whether my concerns had any real basis. Things weren't adding up, and I planned to find out why. I began noticing more and more small details about Sarah, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, but collectively forming a picture I couldn't ignore. I've never been one to jump to conclusions, but my instincts told me that something was off. I wasn't about to accuse Sarah outright or let emotions cloud my judgment. If I was wrong, I wanted to preserve the trust between us. If I was right, I needed the truth. Either way, I decided to proceed cautiously and without making a scene. The first step was checking her phone. I'd never gone through Sarah's personal belongings before. It felt intrusive, even wrong, but the circumstances seemed to justify it. One night, after she had fallen into a deep sleep, I quietly took her phone from the bedside table. To my surprise, it was now protected by a new passcode. Sarah had always been casual about her phone security, using simple patterns or none at all. This change caught my attention. The next morning, I casually asked her why she had set a new password. Sarah didn't miss a beat, explaining that a friend of hers had recently lost her phone and it made her realize the importance of securing personal data, especially with all the family photos and important information stored on it. Her reasoning was sound, and her tone was calm and convincing. Still, the explanation stuck in my mind. It wasn't conclusive, but it was a starting point, a loose thread to pull at. Not wanting to push further, I decided to try a different approach. Sarah had often mentioned volunteering at a local homeless shelter, something she was genuinely passionate about. I found the shelter's contact information online and called them, posing as a curious resident interested in volunteering. During the call, I casually brought up Sarah's name, asking about her involvement. To my surprise, the woman on the other end immediately recognized her. She spoke highly of Sarah, praising her dedication and even mentioning her significant contributions to a recent event. The conversation left me feeling conflicted. Her work at the shelter was real, and my suspicions, at least regarding this aspect of her life, seemed misplaced. Despite this, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being overlooked. A few days later, Sarah told me she was meeting friends at a cafe downtown and might stop by a nearby boutique to look at some new clothes. This time, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I made up an excuse about needing to catch up on work from home and waited until she left. About half an hour later, I followed her. Cautiously driving through the city, I eventually spotted Sarah exiting the cafe. She was indeed with two of her friends, chatting animatedly. They appeared to be deeply engrossed in conversation, and nothing about the scene seemed unusual. I parked my car nearby and watched as they left the cafe and walked into a shopping center together. I waited, keeping a safe distance, as Sarah and her friends moved from store to store. She emerged after some time carrying a couple of shopping bags, still laughing and talking with her friends. Her demeanor was relaxed and genuine, with no signs of anything out of the ordinary. Satisfied that she was heading home, I returned before her, ensuring she wouldn't suspect anything. When she arrived, Sarah seemed excited about her purchases and eagerly showed me the dresses she'd bought. Her behavior was consistent with what she'd told me earlier, and there was no indication of deceit. For all intents and purposes, everything seemed to align. Yet, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something deeper was going on. At this point, my frustration was building. Every step I took to uncover the truth seemed to lead nowhere. The only real anomaly was the new password on her phone, but even that had a plausible explanation. I started questioning myself. Was I being overly suspicious? Was I reading too much into innocent actions? The doubts were beginning to weigh on me, but I wasn't ready to let them go. I began paying closer attention to Sarah's routines. She'd always been outgoing, but now I noticed small changes, extra time spent getting ready, a slightly different energy when she talked about her plans. I started keeping track of her comings and goings, not in an obsessive way, but enough to create a mental map of her activities. If there was a pattern, I wanted to find it. One evening, while we were watching TV, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it briefly before setting it face down on the coffee table. It was a small action, but one that stood out to me. Sarah had never been secretive with her phone before. These little shifts in behavior, while subtle, added to the overall sense of unease. Still, I didn't want to act rashly. I'd always prided myself on being measured and logical, and this situation called for a level head. Instead of confronting Sarah directly, I decided to confide in someone I trusted. My best friend, Tom, came to mind immediately. We'd known each other for years, and he was someone who always had a grounded perspective. I felt certain that he'd give me honest advice and help me think through my next steps. The decision to involve Tom wasn't one I took lightly. I valued my privacy, and sharing details about my concerns felt like crossing a line. But the alternative, continuing to wrestle with doubts alone, wasn't sustainable. If anyone could help me approach the situation objectively, it was him. I decided to call him the next day and lay everything out. Together, we'd figure out the best way forward. I knew I needed to tread carefully. The last thing I wanted was to jeopardize my relationship with Sarah over misunderstandings or baseless accusations. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the lingering sense that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't just about the password or the phone or even the sunglasses from before. It was about the overall pattern, the subtle inconsistencies that kept adding up. As I reflected on the past few weeks, I felt a renewed determination. Whatever the truth was, I was going to find it. and I wasn't going to let doubts or uncertainties hold me back. With Tom's help, I'd get to the bottom of this. I owed it to myself to know for sure. And so, I made the decision to call him. Tomorrow, I'd share everything I'd observed and ask for his perspective. Together, we'd piece things together and uncover what was really going on. Feeling overwhelmed and unable to piece everything together on my own, I decided it was time to involve someone I trusted completely. The doubts gnawed at me, but every time I tried to get a clear answer, Sarah seemed to slip through my fingers like water. That's when I called Tom, my best friend from our college days. Tom had always been the type of guy to cut through the noise, straightforward and analytical. If anyone could help me, it was him. I laid everything out for him, the inconsistencies, my failed attempts to understand what was really happening, and the growing suspicion that wouldn't let me rest. Tom listened patiently, then assured me we'd figure it out. "We'll handle this the right way," he said confidently, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of relief. Our first plan was simple: confirm Sarah's story about volunteering at the homeless shelter. She'd told me she was going to her usual weekly shift, and Tom and I decided to follow her. We waited in his car a block away from the house, watching as she got into her car and drove off. Keeping a safe distance, we tailed her to the shelter. Sure enough, she parked, got out, and walked inside with a purposeful stride. We stayed put, watching the entrance. After about 2 hours, Sarah emerged carrying a box of documents, which she handed to another staff member before heading back to her car. Everything seemed above board. Tom joked that maybe Sarah was just a saint and I was imagining things. I laughed nervously, but the unease lingered. It wasn't just about this one instance, there were too many unanswered questions. The next test came a few days later when Sarah said she was helping her friend Mary prepare for a late-night charity event. This time, Tom offered to follow her alone while I stayed home. Around an hour after she left, Tom called to report that he'd seen her enter a large event hall where people were indeed setting up for what looked like a formal gathering. He even snapped a few photos from the parking lot and sent them to me. Looking at the pictures, I felt conflicted. Everything seemed legitimate, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something critical. Tom's reassurance helped, but I wasn't entirely convinced. The third situation was meant to be decisive. Sarah had plans to meet her friends at a downtown cafe for the evening. This time, Tom and I crafted a more detailed plan. He would stay outside to monitor her movements while I went inside as a casual customer to verify her story. When Sarah arrived, I followed shortly after and saw her seated at a table with 2 women. They were chatting and laughing, just as she'd said they would. I ordered a coffee and stayed long enough to observe without drawing attention. Everything seemed normal, so I left and called Tom to check in. He told me he'd seen her leave the cafe and drive off toward home. I returned shortly after, expecting to find her already there. But Sarah wasn't home. She arrived almost an hour later, carrying a grocery bag and explaining that she'd stopped to pick up a few items on her way back. Her story was plausible, but something about the timeline didn't sit right with me. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but the gap between her leaving the cafe and coming home felt like another piece of a puzzle I didn't have all the edges for. In the days that followed, I started noticing subtle discrepancies in Tom's accounts. For instance, during the charity event surveillance, he'd mentioned not being able to get closer due to security, yet the photos he'd sent showed a clear view of the parking lot with no obvious barriers. Similarly, when he reported seeing Sarah leave the cafe, he hadn't mentioned her stopping anywhere else, even though she'd arrived home much later than expected. These small inconsistencies began to add up, and for the first time, I started questioning Tom's role in all of this. The turning point came when I accidentally caught a glimpse of Tom's phone during one of our conversations. A message thread was open, and I distinctly saw Sarah's name among the recent chats. He quickly locked the screen, but the moment stuck with me. Why was he messaging Sarah, and what were they talking about? I didn't confront him then, but it was as if a switch had flipped in my mind. The one person I thought I could rely on was now part of the growing web of uncertainty. I started paying closer attention to Tom's behavior. His eagerness to help, which had initially seemed supportive, now felt overbearing. He was always quick to dismiss my concerns, insisting that Sarah's actions were innocent and that I was overthinking everything. While his words were reassuring, his actions started to feel calculated, as though he was steering me away from something. One evening, I decided to test Tom. I casually mentioned a hypothetical plan to follow Sarah again, this time without involving him. His reaction was immediate and oddly defensive. He suggested it wasn't necessary and that we'd already done enough to prove she wasn't hiding anything. His insistence only deepened my doubts. I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that Tom might be hiding something from me. The thought was almost too much to process. He was my closest friend, someone I'd trusted implicitly for years. But now, his involvement felt less like support and more like interference. It was as if he had a stake in keeping me from finding out the truth. The situation reached a boiling point when I noticed another oddity. Tom had started avoiding certain topics, particularly when it came to Sarah. If I brought up a new plan or observation, he'd quickly change the subject or downplay its significance. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. The final straw came when Sarah's name appeared in a context I hadn't expected. While scrolling through social media, I stumbled upon a post tagged by a mutual acquaintance. It was a photo from an event I didn't recognize, and in the comments, someone mentioned both Tom and Sarah being there. My stomach dropped. Why hadn't either of them mentioned this to me? The pieces were starting to fall into place, and the picture they painted wasn't pretty. By this point, I knew I couldn't trust either of them blindly. The realization was both painful and galvanizing. Whatever was happening, it was clear that I was on my own. If I wanted the truth, I'd have to approach this from a completely different angle. No more relying on Tom, no more second-guessing myself. At that moment, I made a decision. The game had changed, and it was time for me to play by my own rules. What happened next would shock everyone involved, including myself. I had reached my limit. Trusting Tom had been a mistake, and every attempt I made to uncover the truth seemed to lead to more confusion. The pieces weren't adding up, and I felt like I was chasing shadows. That's when I decided to bring in a professional. I needed someone objective, someone with the skills to see what I couldn't. Hiring a private investigator was a step I never thought I'd take, but at this point, it felt like the only way forward. That's how I met Jackson Race. He came highly recommended, a calm, experienced man who exuded confidence. The truth will come out, he assured me, but it'll take time. The first lead came just a few days into Jackson's investigation. Sarah mentioned she was meeting her friends at a cafe downtown. Jackson shadowed her, discreetly keeping tabs on her movements. She arrived at the cafe as planned, greeted two women at a table, and spent over an hour with them. On the surface, everything seemed normal. However, Jackson later uncovered something that shook me. One of the friends Sarah was meeting wasn't just an ordinary acquaintance. She was a professional actress, known locally for appearing in small commercials and promotional videos. Why would Sarah involve someone like that in a simple coffee outing? The implication was clear: Sarah had staged the meeting to throw off any suspicions. It was a chilling realization. Who hires an actress to create an alibi? Jackson cautioned me against jumping to conclusions. There's more going on here, he said, and we'll get to the bottom of it. I tried to hold back my frustration, but the revelation only deepened my resolve. Something was being hidden from me, and it was more elaborate than I'd imagined. The second breakthrough came during one of Sarah's supposed volunteer shifts at the homeless shelter. Jackson decided to step things up by installing surveillance cameras around the facility. He watched as Sarah arrived at the shelter and entered through the main doors. Less than 10 minutes later, she exited through a back door and got into a waiting car. Jackson's footage clearly showed her sitting in the passenger seat while the driver, none other than Tom, took the wheel. Seeing that video made my blood boil. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was evidence. Tom and Sarah were clearly working together, and whatever they were doing, it wasn't innocent. Jackson, ever the professional, calmed me down. "We're getting closer," he said. "But we need to be patient." His reassurance kept me from storming over to confront them right then and there. Instead, I let him proceed with the investigation. The third incident was the final nail in the coffin. Sarah claimed she was going to visit her sister to help prepare for a party. Jackson, now fully invested in the case, decided to follow her himself. I stayed back, waiting for updates as he tracked her movements. She drove across town but didn't stop at her sister's house. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of a small hotel on the outskirts of the city. Jackson watched as she entered the hotel through a side entrance. Moments later, another car pulled up. Tom stepped out and followed her inside. This time, Jackson captured everything on camera. I was sitting in my car nearby, receiving updates from Jackson in real time. My chest tightened with every word. Hearing that Sarah and Tom were meeting at a hotel was like a punch to the gut. There was no plausible explanation for what I was seeing. It was betrayal, plain and simple. Jackson suggested we wait to gather more evidence. "We need to see what they're doing," he said. Reluctantly, I agreed. For the next 2 hours, we waited as the minutes dragged by. When Sarah and Tom finally emerged, they were holding hands. The sight of it was like a dagger to my heart. Jackson's cameras caught everything, the looks they exchanged, the way they glanced around to make sure no one was watching. This was no coincidence. It was deliberate and calculated. I thought I'd feel anger when I saw the evidence, but instead, there was a hollow emptiness. The truth I'd been searching for was finally in front of me, and it was worse than I'd imagined. The woman I'd shared my life with and the friend I'd trusted for years had been deceiving me. Their actions weren't just careless, they were cruel. Jackson handed over the materials, our videos, photos, and a detailed report of their movements. He'd done his job thoroughly, and now it was up to me to decide what to do with the information. I sat in silence for what felt like hours, staring at the evidence. Every frame told a story of lies and betrayal. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I made up my mind to confront Sarah. There was no point in delaying the inevitable. She needed to see the evidence, to know that I knew everything. But I wasn't sure how I'd handle the conversation. Would I be calm and composed, or would the weight of it all overwhelm me? Either way, I planned to face her that evening when she came home. As I waited, the house felt different. Every corner seemed to hold a memory of our life together, now tainted by the truth. I replayed the moments in my mind, the times I'd doubted her, the times she'd smiled and reassured me. It all felt like a cruel joke. I thought about Tom, too. His betrayal cut just as deeply. He'd been my confidant, my ally, and he'd used that position to deceive me. Jackson offered to stay nearby in case things got out of hand, but I declined. This was something I needed to do alone. Whatever happened next, it would be between Sarah and me. The truth was out, and there was no going back. But as I sat there, waiting for her to walk through the door, I had the distinct feeling that this was only the beginning. I didn't know what would happen when I confronted Sarah, but one thing was certain, the events that followed would change everything. Stay with me, because this story is far from over. When Sarah walked into the house, I was already waiting for her in the living room. The evidence Jackson had collected, the photos, the videos, the damning proof of her betrayal, was spread across the coffee table. My face was cold, my gaze unrelenting. Sarah froze as she saw the materials. The truth was laid bare, and she knew it. "I know everything," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence. I gestured to the table. "You betrayed me with Tom. My best friend." "How could you?" She tried to say something, but I cut her off. "Pack your things. I don't want to see you here anymore." I expected tears, anger, maybe even desperate apologies. Instead, she surprised me. Calmly, she said, "Wait. Don't rush to conclusions. Let's make a deal." Her composure caught me off guard. "A deal? What could you possibly offer?" My anger simmered just below the surface. She smiled faintly, as if she had the upper hand. I'll give you the right to cheat. Do what you want, with whoever you want. We'll call it even. Just don't destroy our marriage. I don't want a divorce. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. She thought I'd accept this as compensation? My pride wouldn't allow it. At that moment, I wanted to throw her out of the house. But then an idea began to form. If she thought this was a game, I'd make sure she lost. Not just lost, I'd make her feel the full weight of betrayal, the way I had. My mind quickly settled on a plan, and it involved someone she never expected, her mother, Julia. Julia was striking for her age. At 50, she carried herself with elegance and grace. She was tall, slender, and possessed the same sharp features that Sarah had inherited. Unlike Sarah, Julia was kind and understanding, always supportive. If I wanted to teach Sarah a lesson, Julia was the perfect choice. My plan wouldn't just be revenge, it would be a masterclass in consequences. The first step was subtle. I started reaching out to Julia more often under the pretense of discussing Sarah. I called her to talk about my marriage struggles, painting a picture of Sarah as selfish and dismissive. Julia, who had always liked me, listened sympathetically. You don't deserve this, Mike, she said during one of our conversations. I knew then that the seed had been planted. Over the next few weeks, our calls became more frequent. I played the role of the wounded husband, carefully crafting my words to gain her trust. Julia's tone became increasingly warm, and she started offering words of encouragement. I could feel the dynamic shifting. You're such a good man, Mike. It's a shame Sarah doesn't see that, she said during one call. I made sure to let those words linger. The next phase was meeting in person. I invited Julia out for lunch, framing it as a chance to discuss how to address Sarah's behavior. At the restaurant, I brought up the evidence of Sarah's infidelity, showing Julia just enough to convince her without overwhelming her. Her reaction was a mix of shock and sadness. I can't believe she'd do this to you, Julia said, her voice trembling slightly. I leaned into the moment, maintaining my role as the wronged party. I just needed someone to talk to. You've always been so understanding, I said, letting my eyes meet hers for a little longer than usual. Julia seemed to notice, but didn't pull away. This was exactly what I needed. The connection was building, piece by piece. For the third phase, I invited Julia to my house. I knew Sarah would be out for one of her volunteers' nights. I prepared everything carefully, soft music, dim lighting, and a bottle of her favorite wine. When she arrived, I welcomed her warmly and guided her to the dining room, where a simple but elegant dinner awaited. Julia seemed touched by the effort. You didn't have to do all this, she said, smiling. As the evening progressed, our conversation grew more personal. I shared how isolated I'd felt since discovering Sarah's betrayal. You're the only person I can trust, I said, taking her hand gently. Julia hesitated but didn't pull away. I could see the internal conflict in her eyes. I didn't push further, knowing the moment would come on its own. By the end of the night, Julia seemed more comfortable around me. The walls she'd put up at the start of the evening were beginning to crumble. I walked her to the door, letting my hand linger on hers as we said goodnight. Thank you for being here, I said sincerely. She looked at me, her expression softening. You're a good man, Mike. Don't forget that. The final stage of my plan required patience. I needed Sarah to see the consequences of her actions firsthand. Julia and I continued to grow closer, with our interactions becoming more frequent and intimate. I didn't rush anything, knowing that the build-up was just as important as the outcome. Every step was calculated, every word carefully chosen. Then, the opportunity came. Sarah returned home one evening to find Julia sitting on the couch with me, laughing over a shared memory. The sight of us together visibly unsettled her. What's going on? She asked, her voice edged with suspicion. I stood up, meeting her gaze with calm determination. Just catching up with someone who's been there for me, I said evenly. The look on Sarah's face was priceless. She didn't say anything, but the tension in the room was palpable. I knew she'd start piecing things together, and that was exactly what I wanted. The game was far from over, and every move I made was designed to make her feel the weight of her betrayal. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control, about reclaiming the power she'd tried to take from me. As I sat back down beside Julia, I felt a sense of satisfaction. The plan was working, and Sarah was starting to realize it. The game had just begun, and I was determined to see it through to the end. What happens next will leave you speechless. For weeks, I lived with the idea of staging the final act of my revenge. Every moment of planning filled me with a cold, calculated focus. I wasn't interested in theatrics for the sake of it. I wanted to ensure that Sarah felt the full weight of her betrayal. This wasn't just about ending our relationship. It was about creating a moment so profound that she would carry it with her for the rest of her life. The first step was preparation. I began by pretending to forgive her. It wasn't easy to hide my true feelings, but I masked them behind a facade of warmth and reconciliation. I showed her the attentive husband she thought she could manipulate. Slowly, I built up the illusion that I was ready to move past her infidelity. I even suggested that we try something new to rekindle our connection. One evening, I proposed a role-playing scenario, presenting it as a fun way to explore trust and intimacy. She seemed intrigued, even excited, completely unaware of my true intentions. When the evening came, I set the scene carefully. The room was dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. I had prepared a chair in the center of the room, complete with silk scarves that would act as restraints. Sarah laughed as I gently tied her wrists to the chair, playing along with what she thought was a harmless game. Her carefree attitude only fueled my resolve. Once she was securely tied, I stepped back, letting the charade drop. "Did you really think I'd just forget everything?" I asked, my voice calm but cold. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by confusion and a flicker of fear. I walked over to the television and pressed play. The screen lit up with a video I had prepared, a recording of me and Julia, her mother. The footage wasn't explicit, but it left no doubt about the nature of our relationship. It showed Julia leaning toward me, her trust and affection evident. Sarah's face drained of color as she realized what she was seeing. I turned to face her, my expression unyielding. "You betrayed me with my best friend," I said. "So I showed your mother what you're truly worth." My words landed like a hammer blow. She looked away from the screen, but the damage was done. The ultimate betrayal wasn't just about what I had done with Julia. It was about taking away her safety net, her ability to manipulate those closest to her. Then came the final twist. As Sarah sat stunned and speechless, Julia entered the room. She was dressed impeccably, her presence commanding attention. Her eyes met Sarah's, filled not with sympathy but with disappointment and determination. "You've used people your entire life," Julia said. "You've manipulated and hurt everyone who's ever cared about you. I'm done protecting you." Sarah's reaction was a mixture of disbelief and desperation. She stammered, trying to find words, but Julia was unmoved. The dynamic between us was clear. Julia stood beside me, a silent but powerful statement that Sarah's actions had driven us together. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about dismantling the foundation of Sarah's self-assuredness. I stepped forward and untied her wrists, but not as a gesture of mercy. I pointed toward the door. "Pack your things and leave," I said. "We're done. Every step you took toward betrayal has led you here. Now it's time for you to face the consequences." Sarah hesitated, her pride and disbelief battling with the reality of her situation. But the evidence was undeniable, and her mother's betrayal stung even more than mine. She stood, her movement stiff and reluctant, and left the room without a word. As the door closed behind her, the silence was almost deafening. I turned to Julia, who looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. We didn't speak, words weren't necessary. The bond we'd formed in those weeks wasn't just about shared pain. It was about mutual respect and understanding, something Sarah had never been capable of fostering. As I sat down, the weight of the moment settled over me. This was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. The marriage I had once cherished was over, shattered by deceit and betrayal. Yet, I didn't feel broken. I felt stronger, as if reclaiming my agency had given me a new sense of purpose. Over the next few days, I began the process of filing for divorce. It wasn't just about cutting legal ties, it was about severing the emotional chains that Sarah had tried to use against me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face it head-on. The evidence Jackson had gathered, combined with Julia's testimony, ensured that the proceedings would go in my favor. Sarah didn't fight the divorce. She knew she had no ground to stand on. Our interactions became purely transactional, limited to discussions about dividing assets and finalizing paperwork. Each meeting reinforced the distance between us, a stark contrast to the closeness we once shared. Through it all, Julia remained a constant presence. She offered support without overstepping, respecting my need to heal at my own pace. Our connection deepened, but it wasn't about replacing what I'd lost. It was about finding something new, built on honesty and mutual respect. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. As I signed the final divorce papers, I felt a sense of closure. The journey had been painful, but it had also been necessary. I had confronted betrayal, reclaimed my dignity, and taken control of my life. The chapter with Sarah was closed, and I was ready to move forward. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: I'd never allow myself to be a victim again. The divorce was just the beginning of a new, stronger version of myself. The divorce between Sarah and me became a true battle, but I was determined not just to leave the marriage, I wanted to emerge victorious. My preparation and resolve proved invaluable, ensuring that the outcome was in my favor. The first strike came financially. Before the proceedings even began, I consulted a skilled attorney who advised me to gather every piece of evidence related to Sarah's infidelity. The videos captured by the private investigator, text messages, and other damning materials became the cornerstone of my case. In court, I not only presented proof of her betrayal but also revealed how she had been siphoning off our shared finances to fund secret rendezvous and gifts for Tom. When the judge saw the extent of Sarah's irresponsibility and deceit, the ruling was clear: I would not be required to share my savings or other personal assets with her. Even more satisfying, the judge granted me the majority of our shared property, including the house. Sarah's attempts to defend herself fell apart under the weight of the evidence. She had expected a different outcome, but her fabricated narratives were no match for hard facts. The second strike targeted her reputation. Financial victory was not enough, I needed to ensure that her actions were laid bare for all to see. For years, Sarah had crafted an image of a devoted wife and socially conscious individual. However, during the divorce proceedings, her double life became public knowledge. Through my attorney, I ensured that the details of her affair with Tom and her reckless behavior were disclosed as part of the case. The ripple effect was immediate. Tom, once considered trustworthy by his family and colleagues, was ostracized, losing the respect and connections he had worked to build. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself isolated from her circle of friends and acquaintances. This wasn't about petty revenge, it was about cutting ties with their toxic influence and reclaiming my dignity. By the time the divorce was finalized, I had not only retained my assets and reputation, but also proved to myself that I could overcome anything. Sarah, on the other hand, was left alone, having lost not just her family but the comfortable life she once knew. Moving forward, I felt stronger and more focused, ready to rebuild my life on a foundation of resilience and integrity.